Evelyn sat in the expansive living room of her luxurious mansion, a place that could rival the palaces of royalty. The gleaming marble floors reflected the muted golden hues of the chandeliers, and every surface seemed to exude wealth. Yet, the air in the room was cold, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. She had imagined her life as something very different when she married Ethan. Love, respect, and mutual support. Those were the promises whispered in their early days together. But now, those dreams felt like distant, hollow echoes. Ethan, her husband, sat across the room, absorbed in his laptop. His sharp features were illuminated by the glow of the screen. A man completely immersed in his world of deals, acquisitions, and numbers. To everyone else, he was a visionary, a self-made millionaire who had clawed his way to the top. To Evelyn, he was a stranger, someone who had traded his soul for power and control. She had tried, in the early years of their marriage, to bridge the growing gap between them. She had believed that beneath his cold exterior lay the man she had fallen in love with. But as the months turned into years, that man seemed to disappear entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the ultrasound picture, a fragile piece of evidence that her life was about to change. Evelyn had hesitated for weeks about how and when to tell Ethan. She had replayed countless scenarios in her head, imagining his reaction. Would he be shocked? Happy? Angry? She hoped, even now, that there might be a flicker of joy in his eyes when he learned the news. Despite everything, a small part of her still believed in the possibility of redemption. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to where Ethan was seated. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice wavering slightly. He didn't look up. "What is it, Evelyn?" "I'm in the middle of something important. I need to talk to you," she said, clutching the photo tighter. "It's important." Ethan sighed heavily, finally shutting his laptop with a loud snap. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What now? Another charity idea? You know those things don't pay off." "It's not about that," she replied, her voice firm despite the lump forming in her throat. She placed the ultrasound picture on the table in front of him. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, there was silence. Ethan stared at the image, his expression unreadable. Then, he leaned forward, picking up the picture as though it were some alien artifact he couldn't comprehend. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were cold and accusing. "You're joking," he said flatly. Evelyn shook her head, feeling a pang in her chest. "I'm not. I've known for a few weeks, and I wanted to be sure before I told you." Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "How could you let this happen?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what this means for me? For us? For us?" Evelyn echoed, her own voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "This isn't just about you, Ethan. This is about our child." Ethan laughed bitterly, pacing the room. "Our child? You think I'm ready to be a father? Do you think this fits into my life right now? Do you even understand what this will do to my reputation?" "Reputation?" she said, her voice breaking. "Is that all you care about?" Ethan stopped and turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Don't twist this around, Evelyn. You've always wanted to trap me, haven't you? You think this baby is some golden ticket to keep me tied to you." The words hit her like a slap. She took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. "How can you say that? After everything I've done for you," he interrupted, his tone venomous. "Do you have any idea how much I've sacrificed to give you this life? And now, you want to derail everything with a baby." Evelyn felt tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "This isn't just about me, Ethan. This is about us. About building a family." "A family?" he scoffed. "I didn't sign up for this, Evelyn. You knew what you were getting into when you married me. I don't have time for a family." She watched as he stormed out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hall. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving her standing alone, clutching the ultrasound picture. The cold silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn sank into a chair, her heart heavy. She had expected resistance, even anger, but not this level of cruelty. She looked at the picture in her hand, the tiny life growing inside her. Despite Ethan's reaction, she felt a surge of determination. This child was hers, and she would protect it with everything she had. She thought back to the life she had left behind when she married Ethan. A simpler, happier life where she had been surrounded by people who truly cared for her. She had walked away from all of it for the promise of love and security. Now, she realized the cost of that decision was higher than she could have ever imagined. But Evelyn had a secret, one she had kept hidden even from Ethan. A secret that gave her strength and hope, even in the darkest moments. She didn't know when or how, but she knew that one day the truth would come to light. And when it did, it would change everything. The days that followed Evelyn's announcement were a blur of tension and unease. Ethan barely spoke to her, retreating to his study or leaving the house for long hours under the pretense of work. When he did acknowledge her presence, it was only to issue cold, dismissive comments about her irresponsibility or to remind her of how inconvenient her pregnancy was for their carefully curated life. Evelyn, hurt but resolute, clung to her inner strength, knowing that her child's life was worth far more than Ethan's approval. One morning, as Evelyn stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast, Ethan walked in, already dressed in a tailored suit, his phone in one hand and his briefcase in the other. Without so much as a glance in her direction, he opened the fridge and grabbed a bottle of water. "Ethan," she said hesitantly, turning toward him. "Can we talk?" He sighed loudly, setting his phone down on the counter. "What now, Evelyn? More about the baby?" "Yes," she said, bracing herself. "I think it's important we discuss this. It's not something we can ignore." He scoffed, taking a sip of water. "I'm not ignoring it. I've made my feelings perfectly clear. You chose to go through with this despite knowing how I feel. That's on you." Her hands trembled, but she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Ethan, this is your child too. Don't you feel any responsibility?" "Any responsibility?" He interrupted, his voice sharp. "Do you think I built my life to be tied down by this? My empire doesn't run on sentiment, Evelyn. It runs on strategy, precision, and discipline. A child doesn't fit into that equation." Evelyn felt a wave of frustration rise within her. "A child isn't an equation, Ethan. It's a life we created together. You can't just pretend it doesn't exist." "Watch me," he said coldly, grabbing his phone and briefcase. "I have meetings all day. Don't wait up." As the door slammed shut behind him, Evelyn sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. She felt trapped, caught between the love she had once felt for Ethan and the reality of the man he had become. She knew she couldn't force him to care, but the weight of his indifference was almost unbearable. The tension reached a boiling point a week later when Ethan invited several of his high-profile business associates to their home for dinner. He didn't bother consulting Evelyn beforehand, leaving her scrambling to organize the event. Despite her growing fatigue and the early signs of morning sickness, she worked tirelessly to ensure everything was perfect. She hoped, in some small way, that her efforts might soften Ethan's attitude toward her. When the guests arrived, Ethan was the perfect host, charming and charismatic. To the outside world, he was every bit the successful and attentive husband. Evelyn played her part, smiling and engaging in polite conversation, though her heart wasn't in it. She noticed how Ethan barely acknowledged her presence, directing his attention instead to his guests. As the evening progressed, one of Ethan's associates, a woman named Clarissa, turned to Evelyn. "So, Evelyn," she said with a warm smile, "what's new with you? Any exciting news to share?" Evelyn hesitated, glancing at Ethan. He gave her a pointed look, a silent warning not to speak. Ignoring the knot of fear in her stomach, she mustered her courage. "Actually, yes. Ethan and I are expecting a baby." The room fell silent for a moment, and all eyes turned to Ethan. He let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. "Evelyn has a way of getting ahead of herself," he said smoothly. "Nothing is set in stone yet." Evelyn felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "It's not something that can be undecided," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I'm already pregnant." Clarissa looked at Evelyn sympathetically, but the moment was quickly overshadowed by Ethan's dismissive tone. "Well, we'll see how things go," he said, steering the conversation back to business. The humiliation was unbearable. Evelyn excused herself and retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she leaned against the counter. She fought back tears, unwilling to let Ethan's callousness ruin her resolve. If he wanted to deny their child, that was his choice, but she wouldn't let his cruelty define her. Later that night, after the guests had left, Evelyn confronted Ethan in their bedroom. "How could you do that to me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. In front of everyone, Ethan was unbothered as he removed his tie, his movements slow and deliberate. "Do what?" "Save us both from unnecessary embarrassment." "Embarrassment?" she repeated, incredulous. "You think our child is an embarrassment?" "I think," he said, turning to face her, "that you don't understand what's at stake here. My reputation, my business, it's all on the line. A child complicates things. It makes me look weak, like I'm distracted from what matters." "What matters?" Evelyn shot back. "Money? Power? Your precious reputation? What about your family? What about me?" Ethan's expression hardened. "Don't make this about you, Evelyn. You're the one who's being selfish." Evelyn laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Selfish? I'm carrying our child, Ethan. I'm the one making sacrifices, not you." He stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know the first thing about sacrifice. Everything you have, this house, your lifestyle, the clothes on your back, it's all because of me. Don't forget that." Evelyn stared at him, her heart breaking. "You're right," she said softly. "Everything I have is because of you. But this child is mine. And nothing you say or do will change that." For the first time, Ethan looked taken aback. He opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and left the room without another word. As the door closed behind him, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, cradling her stomach. She felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination. Ethan's rejection was painful, but it only strengthened her resolve to protect her child. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was prepared to face it alone if necessary. In the silence of the room, Evelyn whispered to her unborn child, "No matter what happens, I'll always fight for you. You'll never have to doubt how much you're loved." And in that moment, Evelyn realized that Ethan's indifference, as painful as it was, would not define her journey. She was stronger than he gave her credit for, and one day, he would realize just how wrong he had been. Evelyn sat by the window of the sunroom, the soft light of the late afternoon casting golden rays across her face. The world outside seemed peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil within her heart. As her hands gently rested on her growing belly, memories of the past began to surface, unbidden yet vivid, as though the years between then and now had dissolved. She had grown up in a small, close-knit town, a place where everyone knew everyone else. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were rich in kindness and love. Her parents, James and Clara, had instilled in her the values of hard work, compassion, and integrity. Evelyn had carried these lessons with her throughout her life, even as she left her small town behind to chase bigger dreams. It was during her early 20s that she moved to the city, full of hope and ambition. She worked as a junior editor at a modest publishing house, dedicating herself to her craft. The job didn't pay much, but she loved it. The stories she helped shape felt like tiny windows into other lives, and in them, she found inspiration and solace. She made friends easily, her warm nature drawing people to her like a magnet. And then, one fateful evening, she met Ethan. He had been a guest speaker at a charity gala her company sponsored, a dazzling figure in a sea of power suits and glittering gowns. Ethan stood out, not just for his undeniable charm, but for the sheer magnetism of his ambition. He had already made a name for himself in the business world, a young tycoon whose rise to wealth and influence seemed almost mythical. When their eyes met across the room, Evelyn had felt an inexplicable pull toward him. Their whirlwind romance had been the stuff of fairy tales, or so it seemed at the time. Ethan showered her with attention, making her feel like the center of his world. He was attentive, generous, and relentless in his pursuit of her. For a girl from a small town, it was intoxicating. They married within a year, despite the quiet reservations of her parents and friends. For a time, everything seemed perfect. Evelyn reveled in the life they built together, filled with luxurious travels, glittering parties, and a home that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But as the years passed, cracks began to form in the facade. Ethan's relentless drive for success consumed him, leaving little room for Evelyn in his world. His once genuine affection was replaced by indifference, and his charming demeanor gave way to arrogance. The man she had fallen in love with seemed to vanish, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Yet, Evelyn stayed. She stayed because she believed in the vows they had taken, in the potential for the man she loved to reemerge. And, deep down, she stayed because of a secret she had carried with her since before their marriage, a secret she had never shared with Ethan. Evelyn's thoughts turned to that secret now, her fingers brushing against the locket she wore around her neck. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph of her late grandfather, Robert, one of the most influential figures in her life. Robert had been a man of quiet strength and wisdom, a pillar of their small-town community. But what few people outside their family knew was that Robert had once been an entrepreneur himself, a man who had built a fortune in his youth before walking away from it all to live a simpler life. When Evelyn was a child, Robert had shared fragments of his story with her, tales of business triumphs and the hard lessons he had learned about the cost of unchecked ambition. He had always said that wealth could be both a blessing and a curse, depending on how it was used. On his deathbed, he had entrusted Evelyn with something precious, a sealed letter and a small key, along with instructions to safeguard them until the time was right. After Robert's passing, Evelyn had followed his wishes. She kept the letter and the key hidden, even as she navigated her new life with Ethan. She had read the letter only once, shortly before her wedding. It revealed that Robert's fortune, carefully invested and grown over decades, was hers to claim when she needed it. But the letter came with a warning: wealth can corrupt even the purest of hearts. Use it wisely, Evelyn, and use it when you are ready to stand on your own. At the time, Evelyn had dismissed the idea of ever needing the fortune. She was in love, after all, and she believed that her life with Ethan would be enough. But now, years later, she couldn't help but wonder if her grandfather had foreseen this very moment. The moment when she would need his wisdom and his gift to protect herself and her unborn child. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was her closest friend, Marissa, who had been her confidant since her days at the publishing house. Marissa had watched Evelyn's marriage to Ethan unfold with a mixture of concern and quiet support, never pushing, but always ready to lend an ear when Evelyn needed her. "Hey," Marissa said gently as she stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning Evelyn's face. "You look like you could use some company." Evelyn managed a small smile. "You know me too well?" They settled into the sunroom, cups of tea in hand. Marissa didn't press for details, but her presence was a balm to Evelyn's frayed nerves. As they talked about lighter topics, Evelyn felt a flicker of warmth return to her chest. It reminded her that not everything in her life was broken. Eventually, Marissa's curiosity got the better of her. "So," she began cautiously, "what are you going to do about everything?" Evelyn sighed, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Ethan's made it clear how he feels about the baby. But I won't let that affect my decision. This child deserves to be loved no matter what." Marissa hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think there's any part of him that could change? That might come around?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the locket around her neck, her fingers tracing its edges. "I used to think so," she said finally. "But now, I'm not sure. The man I fell in love with feels like a memory. And if he doesn't change, I'll find a way to do this on my own." The conviction in her voice surprised even her. It was the first time she had acknowledged the possibility of a future without Ethan, a future where she relied on her own strength, and perhaps the legacy her grandfather had left behind. As Marissa left later that evening, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of clarity. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind was now her guiding light, a reminder that she came from a line of resilient, determined people. Her grandfather's fortune, though untouched, was a symbol of that resilience. And while she didn't know when or how she would use it, she knew it was there, waiting for the moment when she would need it most. For now, Evelyn focused on the present. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered softly, "We're going to be okay. I promise." As Evelyn's pregnancy progressed, the strain in her relationship with Ethan only deepened. The tension between them seemed to seep into every corner of their home, transforming the once lavish mansion into a cold, unwelcoming fortress. Ethan's distance grew more pronounced, and his words, when he did speak to her, became sharper, each one a small dagger aimed at her resolve. The days were long and lonely for Evelyn, who found herself navigating the challenges of pregnancy with little support. The symptoms were hitting her hard: morning sickness that left her weak and drained, backaches that made even the simplest tasks difficult, and a pervasive exhaustion that seemed to settle into her bones. Yet, Ethan remained indifferent, his focus locked on his business empire. Evelyn tried, in her own quiet way, to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She attended her doctor's appointments alone, prepared meals for herself, and spent hours reading about pregnancy and child-rearing. She hoped that each small step she took toward motherhood might stir something in Ethan, some buried spark of empathy or care. But if it did, he gave no sign. One afternoon, Evelyn overheard Ethan on the phone in his study. His voice was low and urgent, the tone he reserved for high-stakes negotiations. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his words carried through the half-open door. "Look, I need this deal to go through," he said. "I can't afford any distractions right now. I don't care what it takes, just make it happen." The word distractions sent a chill through her. She knew exactly what he meant. To Ethan, she and the baby were obstacles, complications that threatened the pristine image he had worked so hard to cultivate. The realization was a knife to her heart, but it also ignited a spark of anger deep within her. Later that week, Ethan threw another of his extravagant dinner parties, inviting a mix of business associates, potential investors, and social elites. Evelyn had learned about the event only hours before the guests arrived, as Ethan casually mentioned it in passing. "It's just a small gathering," he said, barely glancing at her. "I expect everything to be in order." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I wish you had told me earlier. I could have prepared something." He waved her off dismissively. "You don't need to worry about that. Just show up and look presentable." The words stung, but Evelyn swallowed her frustration. She dressed carefully that evening, choosing a simple yet elegant gown that accommodated her growing belly. As she stood before the mirror, she placed a hand on her stomach, drawing strength from the life within her. When the guests arrived, Ethan was in his element, charming and commanding as he worked the room. Evelyn, meanwhile, felt like an outsider in her own home. She smiled politely, exchanged pleasantries, and did her best to avoid Ethan's cutting remarks. The evening took a darker turn when one of Ethan's guests, a brash and arrogant man named Victor, made an offhand comment about Evelyn's pregnancy. "So, Ethan," Victor said, swirling his glass of scotch, "I hear congratulations are in order. I didn't think you were the family type." Ethan's smile faltered for a moment before he recovered, laughing lightly. "Well, life is a way of surprising you." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Surprising, huh? Doesn't sound like you're too thrilled about it." Ethan's expression darkened, and for a fleeting moment, Evelyn thought he might defend her. Instead, he shrugged. "Let's just say it wasn't exactly planned." The words hung in the air like a slap. Evelyn's face burned with humiliation, but she held her composure, refusing to let her hurt show. She excused herself quietly and retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Her closest ally that evening turned out to be the head chef, Maria, who had worked for the household for years. Maria, a warm and perceptive woman, placed a comforting hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Senora, you shouldn't let him treat you like this," Maria said softly. "You're stronger than he thinks." Evelyn blinked back, tears nodding. "Thank you, Maria. I need to get through tonight." Maria gave her a reassuring smile. "You will. And when the time comes, you'll show him what you're made of." Those words stayed with Evelyn as the evening dragged on. By the time the last guest had left, she was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Ethan, however, seemed unaffected, as if the night had been nothing more than another notch in his belt of accomplishments. As they stood in the living room, Surrounded by empty glasses and discarded napkins, Evelyn couldn't hold back any longer. "Do you even realize how much you embarrassed me tonight?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. Ethan looked at her as though she were an inconvenience. "Oh, don't be so dramatic." Victor's comments weren't serious. "It's not about Victor," she shot back. "It's about you. The way you talk about our baby, as if it's some kind of burden. Do you even care about us at all?" Ethan's expression hardened. "Don't start with this again, Evelyn. You knew what you were getting into when you married me. I don't have time for this kind of sentimentality." Her anger flared. "This isn't sentimentality, Ethan. This is your child. Our child. And if you can't see that, then maybe I need to stop hoping you ever will." He scoffed, grabbing his phone from the table. "You can do whatever you want, Evelyn. Just leave me out of it." Evelyn watched as he walked away, his indifference cutting deeper than any insult. She felt a surge of resolve rise within her. If Ethan wanted to abandon her emotionally, then so be it. She would find the strength to stand on her own, for herself and for her child. That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn made a silent vow. She would no longer let Ethan's apathy dictate her happiness. She would focus on the life growing inside her, the one source of light in an otherwise dark and lonely world. And when the time came, she would make decisions that were best for her and her child, even if it meant leaving Ethan behind. Little did she know, the seeds of her strength were already taking root, and the escalation of tension between them was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Evelyn woke up the next morning to the sharp pang of nausea, her body protesting the stress she had endured the previous night. She clutched the edge of the bed, breathing deeply, willing the dizziness to pass. The physical toll of her pregnancy was catching up to her, exacerbated by the emotional weight of Ethan's indifference. But there was no time to dwell on her discomfort. She had learned to cope with her struggles alone, relying on her resilience and determination to push through each day. Her first task was to attend a prenatal checkup, an appointment Ethan once again refused to accompany her to. Evelyn had stopped asking him to come after his repeated excuses. "I'm busy," he'd say, without looking up from his phone. "Can't you handle it on your own?" And so she did, sitting in the sterile waiting room of the clinic, surrounded by excited couples eagerly chatting about their upcoming bundles of joy. Evelyn felt the sting of loneliness pierce her heart. She was happy about her baby, but she couldn't ignore the ache of not having someone by her side to share the experience. When the nurse called her name, she stood and followed, forcing a smile as she entered the examination room. The doctor greeted her warmly, noting her pallor and fatigue. "How have you been feeling, Evelyn?" he asked, glancing at her chart. "Tired," she admitted, "a little overwhelmed, but I'm managing." The doctor gave her a concerned look. "You need to take it easy. Stress and exhaustion aren't good for you or the baby." Evelyn nodded, her heart sinking. She wished she could take it easy, but her circumstances made that nearly impossible. Still, she promised herself she would try, if only for the sake of her child. When the ultrasound screen flickered to life, showing the tiny, fluttering heartbeat of her baby, a swell of emotion rose in her chest. In that moment, she knew she would do whatever it took to protect this life inside her. After the appointment, Evelyn walked home, her hands clutching the ultrasound printout. She paused at a nearby park, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree. She watched as children played on the swings, their laughter filling the air. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what life might be like once her baby was born. Would they come to this park together? Would they laugh and play like the family she saw now? The thought gave her a glimmer of hope, a light in the darkness. When she returned home, the house was eerily quiet. Ethan was gone, as usual, and there was no sign of when, or if, he would return that evening. Evelyn busied herself with small tasks to fill the void, organizing the nursery she had started to prepare. She had chosen a soft palette of yellow and gray, neutral tones that felt warm and inviting. As she folded tiny clothes and arranged stuffed animals on the shelves, she found comfort in the act of creating a space for her baby. But the solitude was heavy. As the weeks passed, Evelyn's struggles intensified. Her body grew more tired, Her back ached constantly, and her ankles swelled to the point where even walking became painful. Despite the physical challenges, she continued to attend to the household, unwilling to let the responsibilities slip. Ethan, meanwhile, remained oblivious to her plight, his focus entirely consumed by his work and social obligations. One particularly grueling day, Evelyn decided to visit her parents. She hadn't seen them in months, partly because Ethan disapproved of her maintaining ties to her small-town roots. But Evelyn desperately needed the comfort of her family, the one place where she could let her guard down. Her mother greeted her at the door with open arms, pulling her into a warm embrace. "Oh, Evelyn, you look exhausted," Clara said, her brow furrowed with concern. "I'm fine, Mom," Evelyn replied, though her voice wavered. James, her father, appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Come in, sweetheart. Let's get you something to eat." The afternoon passed in a blur of comfort and familiarity. Evelyn shared some of her struggles, though she downplayed the extent of Ethan's indifference. Her parents, ever supportive, offered their love and encouragement. "You're stronger than you think," her father said, his voice steady. "And no matter what happens, we're here for you. Always." Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude, tears welling in her eyes. It was a relief to know she wasn't entirely alone, even if her immediate circumstances felt isolating. She left their house that evening with a renewed sense of resolve, vowing to lean on their support when she needed it most. Back at home, Ethan's absence was glaring. He hadn't even noticed she was gone, and when he finally returned late that night, his only comment was a sarcastic remark about her disappearing act. Evelyn bit her tongue, refusing to engage in another argument. She was too tired to fight, too weary to try and make him understand. Days turned into weeks, and Evelyn's strength was tested further. A scare late one evening left her rushing to the hospital alone when she began experiencing sharp abdominal pain. She sat in the sterile emergency room, gripping her stomach, praying that her baby was okay. The doctor assured her that it was a false alarm, likely brought on by stress and overexertion. Still, the experience left her shaken. She returned home to find Ethan asleep, oblivious to her ordeal. The breaking point came one afternoon when Evelyn overheard Ethan on another phone call. His tone was colder than usual, laced with irritation. "She keeps pushing this baby nonsense," he said. "It's like she doesn't get it. I'm not built for this family stuff. If she wants to play house, she can do it without me." Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. She had tried so hard to hold things together, to give Ethan the chance to change, to grow into the father her child needed. But his callousness was unrelenting, and it was clear that he saw her and the baby as nothing more than obstacles to his ambition. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Evelyn made a decision. She could no longer sacrifice her happiness and her child's future for the sake of a man who refused to see their worth. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't keep living like this. Her struggles had only made her stronger, and she was ready to take control of her life. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt a sense of clarity. She placed a hand on her belly, whispering softly to her unborn child. "We'll be okay," she said. "I promise." And for the first time, she believed it. Ethan's carefully curated world began to crumble, though he didn't realize it at first. His confidence, once an impenetrable shield, blinded him to the precariousness of his empire. His business had always been his top priority, his obsession, the very thing that defined him. But like all things built on shaky foundations, cracks started to form, and soon those cracks widened into chasms. It started with whispers in the boardrooms, rumors of discontent among his senior executives. Ethan, oblivious to the human cost of his relentless drive for success, had alienated many of the people who had once been his closest allies. Long hours, impossible demands, and his unwillingness to compromise had created a toxic work environment. Employees left quietly, replaced by others who rarely lasted long under the immense pressure. Ethan dismissed it as the cost of doing business. But then, the first major blow came. A key client, one of the largest accounts in his portfolio, abruptly severed ties with his company. The reason? A scandal involving a subsidiary Ethan had acquired in a hostile takeover. Allegations of unethical practices surfaced, tarnishing the reputation Ethan had worked so hard to build. While the media frenzy was manageable at first, it soon spiraled out of control, with reporters digging into every corner of his business dealings. Ethan's name was splashed across headlines, his picture plastered on tabloids. The words corrupt and ruthless appeared next to his face, eroding the pristine image he had cultivated for years. Investors began to pull out, fearing further fallout. Ethan's attempts to control the narrative fell flat. For the first time, his charm and smooth talking couldn't save him. At home, Evelyn watched the chaos unfold from a distance. She had seen the signs of his downfall long before they became public, but she felt no satisfaction in his misery. If anything, she felt a deep sadness for the man Ethan could have been. Yet, she didn't step in to offer comfort. Ethan had pushed her away too many times, and she knew he would reject any attempt she made to support him. He had chosen this path, and now he was facing the consequences. Ethan, however, was not ready to admit defeat. He threw himself deeper into his work, determined to claw his way back to the top. He spent long hours at the office, barely eating or sleeping, and when he did come home, he was a shadow of the man he used to be, angry, irritable, and on edge. Evelyn often heard him pacing in his study late into the night, shouting at someone on the phone or cursing under his breath. The second blow came when Ethan's most trusted business partner, a man named Richard, betrayed him. Richard had been with Ethan since the early days, helping him build his empire from the ground up. But when the scandal broke, Richard saw an opportunity to distance himself and protect his own interests. He leaked sensitive documents to the press, painting Ethan as the sole architect of the unethical practices that had come to light. The betrayal cut deep, not only because of the professional damage, but because Ethan had considered Richard one of his only friends. Ethan spiraled further. The walls of his life seemed to close in around him. His financial losses mounted, and with them came legal troubles. Lawsuits piled up, and regulators launched investigations into his business practices. Ethan's once unshakable confidence began to waver. He started to avoid public appearances, retreating into the sanctuary of his home. But even there, he found no solace. The house, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison, and Evelyn, whom he had taken for granted for so long, seemed more distant than ever. One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey, he allowed himself to think about how things had gotten to this point. He had always prided himself on being in control, on having all the answers. But now he felt lost. The money, the power, the status, none of it mattered if he couldn't keep it. And for the first time in years, he wondered if he had been wrong, if he had prioritized the wrong things. He thought about Evelyn, about the way she had looked at him when she told him she was pregnant. At the time, he had seen it as an inconvenience, a threat to his carefully planned life. But now, in the silence of his empty study, he realized how much he had hurt her. He had pushed her away when she had only wanted to share a moment of joy with him. He had dismissed her, humiliated her, and treated her as though she were nothing more than a burden. The weight of his actions began to settle on him. He thought about the baby, his child, a child he had rejected without a second thought. What kind of man had he become? His arrogance and ambition had cost him everything: his business, his reputation, and now, possibly, his family. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something unfamiliar and uncomfortable: regret. But regret alone wasn't enough to pull Ethan out of his downward spiral. The final blow came when his financial troubles reached a breaking point. Creditors began calling in debts, and with no cash flow to cover his obligations, Ethan was forced to sell off assets just to stay afloat. The mansion, the cars, the luxury vacations, all of it slipped through his fingers like sand. The life he had built, the empire he had created, crumbled before his eyes. Evelyn, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines. She had made her peace with the idea that Ethan might never change, but as she saw him fall deeper into despair, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the reckoning he needed. She had stopped expecting him to show up for her and the baby. focusing instead on preparing for the future. But a part of her still hoped that Ethan might find his way back to the man she had once loved. One night, as Evelyn sat in the nursery folding baby clothes, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a man who had been stripped of everything, and in many ways he had. But there was something different in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable. "Evelyn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you." She hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Evelyn waited, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "I've lost everything," he said finally, his voice cracking. "Everything I thought mattered. And now, all I can think about is how much I've hurt you, how much I've pushed you away." Evelyn sat across from him, her hands resting on her lap. "Ethan," she said softly, "what do you want from me?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I want to be better. For you, for the baby." Evelyn's heart ached at his words, but she knew that redemption wouldn't come easily. Ethan had a long way to go, and she wasn't sure if she could trust him again. But in that moment, she saw a glimmer of the man he could become, a man who might finally understand what truly mattered. "I can't promise anything," she said, her voice steady. "But if you're serious about changing, it has to start with you." Ethan nodded, a single tear sliding down his cheek. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. And for the first time, Evelyn thought he might actually mean it. The atmosphere in the house had shifted, but not enough for Evelyn to let down her guard. Ethan had begun to show signs of change. Small, hesitant gestures that suggested he was trying to mend the cracks in their fractured relationship. He apologized for small things, like missing a dinner she had prepared or forgetting to ask about her latest doctor's appointment. For someone like Ethan, whose ego rarely allowed him to admit fault, these small moments felt monumental. But for Evelyn, they were not enough. She had learned the hard way that words without action were hollow, and Ethan had yet to prove he could truly change. Still, she couldn't ignore the faint stirrings of hope. For weeks, Ethan had been quietly withdrawing from his business dealings, selling off assets to cover his debts and paying close attention to the few ventures he still controlled. Though his financial empire had crumbled, Ethan seemed to be using the fall as an opportunity to reassess his priorities. Evelyn saw him more often at home, lingering in the nursery or asking her tentative questions about the baby. Yet, she remained cautious, unsure if this was genuine growth or a temporary reaction to his losses. The moment of reckoning came one evening when Ethan returned home earlier than usual. Evelyn was in the nursery, arranging tiny baby clothes in a drawer. She heard his footsteps in the hallway and turned to see him standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "Evelyn," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Can we talk?" She nodded, folding a onesie and placing it on the dresser. "What is it?" He stepped inside, his hands in his pockets, and for a moment he seemed to struggle for words. Finally, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and held it out to her. "I found this," he said, in one of the boxes in the storage room. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the letter. It was the one her grandfather had left her, the one she had kept hidden for years. She hadn't realized it was in the storage room, having moved it during one of her many reorganizations of the house. She hesitated before taking it from him, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of the paper. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his tone laced with curiosity and a hint of frustration. "Why didn't you tell me about it?" Evelyn unfolded the letter and scanned the familiar handwriting, her mind racing. She had kept the truth about her grandfather's fortune from Ethan for years, not because she didn't trust him at first, but because she had wanted to carve out a life with him that wasn't defined by money. But now, standing before him, she realized there was no way to avoid the conversation. "This letter," she began, her voice steady, "is from my grandfather. Before he passed away, he entrusted me with something, a financial inheritance, an investment portfolio that he grew over decades. It's substantial." Ethan's eyes widened. "How substantial?" Evelyn hesitated, then decided there was no point in withholding the truth. Enough to rival what you've lost. Enough to rebuild your business, if that's what you wanted. Ethan's face was a mixture of shock and disbelief. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room as he processed the information. "You've had access to this all along?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Because it wasn't meant to be a lifeline for us, Ethan. My grandfather entrusted it to me with a warning. He said wealth has the power to corrupt, to destroy relationships and people. I didn't want it to come between us, but it could have helped," Ethan argued. "When everything was falling apart, it could have saved me." "Saved you?" Evelyn's voice grew sharper. "Ethan, that's exactly why I didn't use it. Because it wouldn't have saved you. It would have enabled you. You would have used it as a crutch, another way to avoid facing the consequences of your choices." Ethan flinched at her words, but he didn't deny them. He sank into the chair by the window, his shoulders slumping as the weight of her revelation settled over him. "So, what happens now?" he asked quietly. "Are you going to use it, or keep it locked away forever?" Evelyn sighed, folding the letter and placing it on the dresser. "I've been thinking about that a lot," she admitted, "and I've decided that this money isn't about you. It's not about saving your reputation or rebuilding your empire. It's about our child, about giving them a future where they'll never have to feel the kind of pressure or loneliness you and I have felt." Ethan looked at her, his eyes softening. "You're right," he said, surprising her. "I've spent my entire life chasing money, power, and recognition. And for what? It's all gone now, and I don't even know who I am without it. But seeing you, seeing how you've handled all of this, it's made me realize how much I've failed you." "Failed us?" Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe him, to believe that his words were more than just guilt or desperation. But trust was something that had to be earned, and Ethan still had a long way to go. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't just about the money. It's about who we are as people, as parents. If you want to be part of this child's life, Ethan, you have to show me that you're capable of putting someone else first, that you're willing to grow and change." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression solemn. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I don't deserve another chance, but if you're willing to give me one, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I've learned from my mistakes." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "We'll see," she said. "Actions speak louder than words." Over the next few weeks, Ethan began to take small but significant steps toward rebuilding his relationship with Evelyn. He attended her doctor's appointments, helped her prepare the nursery, and even started seeing a therapist to address the root of his arrogance and ambition. Though the journey was far from over, Evelyn saw glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with, the man she hoped could become a better father and partner. As for the inheritance, Evelyn kept it safely tucked away, knowing it wasn't the solution to their problems, but a tool she could use when the time was right. For now, she focused on the future, on the life growing inside her, and the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she had the strength to face it, no matter what. Evelyn sat in the nursery, her mind heavy with thoughts of the past few months. Ethan's sudden breakdown had surprised her, but she remained cautious. She couldn't afford to make decisions based solely on his words. He needed to show her that he was ready to change. As she organized the baby's belongings, her fingers brushed against the locket around her neck, and a deep sigh escaped her lips. The locket held more than a picture. It was a symbol of her strength and the legacy her grandfather had left behind. It contained the key to her secret, the one she had kept hidden even as her marriage unraveled. It was time. If Ethan truly wanted to be part of her life and their child's, he needed to understand what she had carried alone for so long. That evening, she found Ethan in the living room. He sat slouched on the couch, his face etched with exhaustion. The once proud man now looked weathered, humbled by his recent fall. She approached him quietly, her presence drawing his attention. He straightened, his eyes searching hers for a clue to what she might say. "I need to talk to you," Evelyn began, her voice steady but firm. There's something you don't know about me, about us. I've kept it from you because I didn't think you'd understand, but now, I think it's time." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening." Evelyn reached for the locket, opening it to reveal the tiny key. She handed it to him, along with an old, sealed envelope. "This belonged to my grandfather," she explained. "He was a man of great integrity and wisdom, and he left me something when he passed. I think it's time you know what it is." Ethan's brows furrowed as he examined the envelope, the weight of its significance dawning on him. He opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside. His eyes scanned the words, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, and finally to disbelief. This says he left you a fortune," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A massive one. Investments, properties, it's worth millions." Evelyn nodded. "He entrusted it to me, but he also warned me to use it wisely. He said wealth has the power to corrupt, to destroy relationships if it's not handled with care. That's why I never told you. I didn't want it to define our marriage." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. The enormity of her revelation was overwhelming. "You've had this all along, and you never told me? I wanted to build a life with you based on love, not money," Evelyn said firmly. "But now I see that keeping this from you may have been a mistake. You deserve to know, especially now that we're bringing a child into this world." Ethan sat in stunned silence, the letter still clutched in his hand. His mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above all others. Evelyn had been far stronger than he had ever given her credit for. She had carried this burden alone, even as he belittled her and pushed her away. The shame of his actions weighed heavily on him. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to ask for it. I've been blind to your strength, your sacrifices. I've spent so long chasing power and wealth, and all the while, the most valuable thing in my life was right here." Evelyn's heart softened at his words, but she remained guarded. "Ethan, words are easy. If you truly mean what you're saying, you need to prove it. Not just to me, but to yourself." "I will," he vowed, tears brimming in his eyes. "I swear, I'll be the man you and our child deserve." Evelyn nodded slowly, a flicker of hope stirring within her. "Then let's take it one step at a time." In the weeks that followed, Ethan set out to make good on his promise. It wasn't easy. The road to redemption was filled with challenges, and his past mistakes cast a long shadow. But for the first time in years, Ethan was willing to confront his flaws and take responsibility for his actions. He started small, addressing his relationship with Evelyn. He apologized, truly apologized, for the pain he had caused her. It wasn't a grand gesture or a one-time event. It was a consistent effort to show her that he was willing to change. He began spending more time at home, helping her with the nursery and attending doctor's appointments with her. He listened when she spoke, something he hadn't done in years. Evelyn, though cautious, began to see glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but it was genuine. Ethan was learning to prioritize his family over his ambition, and for the first time, he seemed to understand what truly mattered. Professionally, Ethan faced the consequences of his downfall head-on. He worked tirelessly to rebuild his reputation, not through manipulation or shortcuts, but through integrity and hard work. He sold off what remained of his crumbling empire and used the funds to settle debts and support the employees who had been affected by his poor decisions. It was a humbling experience, but it also gave him a sense of purpose beyond wealth and status. As Ethan rebuilt himself, Evelyn began to let her guard down. She allowed herself to hope that their family could have a future together. The arrival of their baby marked a turning point. The moment Ethan held his newborn daughter in his arms, he was overcome with emotion. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at the tiny life they had created. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for giving me another chance." Evelyn watched him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and relief. For so long, she had doubted whether Ethan could truly change, but in that moment, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't the man he had been when she first told him about the pregnancy. He was someone new, someone better, Over time, their family found a new rhythm. Ethan embraced fatherhood with a zeal that surprised even him. He spent hours with their daughter, reading to her, rocking her to sleep, and marveling at every little milestone. Evelyn, in turn, found herself opening up to him again, sharing her dreams and fears without the wall she had built to protect herself. The fortune Evelyn had inherited became a tool for good. Together, she and Ethan established a foundation to support struggling families and underprivileged children, a way to honor her grandfather's legacy and give back to the community. It was a joint effort, one that brought them closer together as they worked toward a shared goal. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, echoes of their past struggles that surfaced from time to time. But they faced those challenges together, committed to building a future that was grounded in love and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan took Evelyn's hand in his. Their daughter played in the yard, her laughter filling the air. "I used to think success was measured by money and power," Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. "But now, I see it's about moments like this. You, our daughter, you're my greatest achievements." Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," Ethan agreed, his grip on her hand tightening. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I never take this for granted again." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. They weren't the same people they had been at the start of their journey, but that was okay. Together, they had faced their flaws, weathered their trials, and emerged stronger for it. And in the end, they had found what mattered most, a love that was worth fighting for.